again, and welcome to the Author Roundup. This special segment of the Book Connection show showcases emerging indie authors who join us for a discussion of their newly published books. Join us for a conversation with our next guest author. Hello, welcome to Author Roundup. I hope you're doing well. My name is Emma, and today I have Michele Gerber, PhD and self-published author of her book, Witness to Addiction, My Son's Journey and How Each Person Can Fight America's Opioid Epidemic. First off, I just want to share a little bit about Dr. Gerber. Dr. Gerber is a mother who has become an activist in fighting the drug epidemic. When her son died of addiction, she turned her research skills to learning about the disease of addiction, founded a grassroots recovery coalition in Washington State, and is now helping to build a large treatment and recovery center. Dr. Gerber, how are you today? And thank you for joining me.
I'm well. How are you? Thank you.
I'm very good. Thank you. So let's talk about your book. Your book is basically a call to action on how we as a country can fight to end the opioid addiction and addiction in general. Can you tell us a little bit more about your book?
Yes, I wrote the book for many reasons, but one is because I think people in this country are frightened by what they're seeing around them as the addiction epidemic grows. We know that an American dies of addiction every 5 minutes.
Mm-hmm.
In my state, Washington State, 7 to 8 people die per day of addiction. And it's something that people didn't confront until a few years ago, until it got so large and so obvious. So I think people are looking for solutions. They're saying, what can I do? Is there anything I can do? Or am I totally helpless here? And I wanted to give some solutions.
I just want to say I'm so sorry for your loss. What was your son's name?
His name was Jim. He was a wonderful man.
Jim, I'm so sorry. I bet you miss him deeply every day.
Thank you.
I want to get to the main messages of your book. Your book offers real life answers to fight addiction and how everyone can contribute to that to fight the drug epidemic. What are some strategies and solutions discussed in your book that people can take from your book?
Well, I break it down by suggestions or actions for parents and grandparents and for employers and for schools and for elected officials and for faith communities and also just for the average general member of the public. So in each category, I have certain solutions. We could start with parents and grandparents.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Their job is the hardest of all. For one thing, teenagers, and that's when people often start using drugs, don't want to spend a lot of time around their parents anyway. They like their peer group. They like to have their privacy in their bedrooms. They like to be on social media a lot. And all of that may be okay. It may be normal teenage behavior, but it may not. It may be more serious. And if drug use is beginning, I think parents definitely need to have the social media passwords of all of their children's devices, as long as those children are financially dependent on them. That's a must. I don't think it's nosy. I think it's imperative. So that's one thing.
How does your book distinguish between approaches that work and don't work?
Well, I think that it's different for every family and every situation. Now, there are some things that absolutely are in common for all these situations, but I like to talk about what I call the hawk and the dove continuum. And that means that the hawk would be a family that decides to be very tough on addiction and right away just do everything to fight it. And the dove would be a family that decides, well, we're just going to wait and see how this goes, and maybe it's not really so bad. Maybe it'll just be a phase. And everywhere in between, there are going to be families that land upon, this is going to be our method, our solution. And really important is that the family stick together, that they make the decisions. Okay, this is what we're going to do if the person shows up drunk or high. This is what we're going to do if the person asks us for money.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so, and we have to have, every family has to have a unified, determined, predetermined answer. So they're not, what do we do this time? You know, maybe it's different than the last time. That
Yeah.
will, that will, and not only give the addicted person kind of room to maneuver, room to
Mm-hmm.
manipulate, but it will also destroy the cohesion of the family.
Yeah. And something like this would be, like wonderful to have in a sense that, yeah, like you said, it's educational. So something like this, parents aren't sure like how to deal properly with it. Do you think there are reference books like that currently, or do you think that there needs to be more practical advice books like yours on
I
addiction?
think mine may be the only one, because what you'll
Mm-hmm.
find is clinical studies, and those are written for psychologists by
Right.
psychologists. They're full of a lot of jargon, and they're fine, but they're
Right.
really not directed at or helpful to the average person. And I also
Right.
think that people may be at home, sitting home, wondering, when are the police going to put a stop to this? When is law
Mm-hmm.
enforcement come in and just eradicate this problem? That's not going to happen. Not
Mm-hmm.
because the police aren't trying hard and working hard, but the supply is endless. It is
Mm-hmm.
absolutely endless. I don't think we can solve this from the supply side. That is, we can't cut off the supply. We
Mm-hmm.
have to stop it on the other side, which is education, prevention, and reducing demand.
And what about other people besides parents and teachers? Obviously, I feel like this book is for everyone and everyone has a role. What about like elected officials, communities, people like that? How does the book pertain to people like that?
Well, here in our area, I did start a recovery coalition,
Mm-hmm.
and one of the ways that we were able to grow and get community support was that we looked for natural allies. And you just mentioned one of those. Elected officials are a natural ally because
Mm-hmm.
they are the ones getting phone calls all the time
Mm-hmm.
from a constituent saying, why haven't you stopped the panhandling? Why haven't you cleaned up the homeless encampments? And so
Right.
they're besieged by these requests and inquiries and criticisms. And so they will come alongside very readily if a citizen group invites them into the process.
Mm-hmm. Another message in your book that you've mentioned is in your description is that you've said that addiction is a real disease, and that's not the way it's been seen throughout history. Why do you believe that it is a disease?
Well, science has done research, and I'm going to say the last 25 years. It
Mm-hmm.
may have started a little sooner than that. It may have started in the late 80s, early 90s, but the general public was not aware of it. It was
Right.
confined to, scientific publications. But
Mm-hmm.
now research is very widely available, showing that the brain actually changes under the
Mm-hmm.
onslaught of these drugs, these chemicals, that neurons and synapses in the brain, connective tissue that sends messages throughout the brain,
Mm-hmm.
they are damaged so that they don't convey messages to the parts of the brain where they're needed. For instance, we know that behind our foreheads is an area called the frontal cortex. That's where actual thinking takes place,
Mm-hmm.
judgment, sequencing, knowing what a consequence will be if you do a certain action. There
Mm-hmm.
are other parts of the brain further back in your skull and down towards your neck and spine that are more centered on emotions, desires, memories, um, sensory things. And
Mm-hmm.
so some of the chemical damage in the brain is that the connections between those areas are damaged. And the message that is supposed to go to the front of the brain and say, stop. There's a
Mhm.
consequence. Something very bad will happen if you do this. Those connections are lost. So that when a person is under the influence of these very
Mhm.
powerful drugs, we look at them and say, why don't they understand what's going to happen
Right.
next? You know,
Right.
they're going to lose their job or they're going to
Yeah.
lose their spouse. They don't, that logic is not computing in their
Mhm.
brain. And so I'm not saying that's an excuse and that we ought to
Right.
excuse the behavior, but we have to understand that logic usually doesn't work, and
Mhm.
consequences such as you will lose your job, you will be thrown out of the house, those don't really register.
Right. So all this research that you just talked about, is that stuff that you knew and found out about while your son had an addiction, or is this after he passed where you learned everything about this? And were there any like research and guides or anything that you seeked out like when this was happening, when he had this disease?
No, and that's very unfortunate. I did not know. And if I had known, things could have been different. I
Mm-hmm.
could have done some things differently.
Mm-hmm.
But certainly there are points along his journey where that knowledge would have been helpful. For one thing,
Right.
we now know for sure that a seriously addicted person needs more than 4 weeks or 1 month in treatment. At the
Mm-hmm.
end of 4 weeks, they are awakening to certain
Mm-hmm.
things, but they're very vulnerable. They are not ready to go out and face
Mm-hmm.
it. And we didn't know that. And so a few times in his life, we paid for a month of treatment and thought,
Right.
oh, now we're done. We're fine. And even the addicted person may totally believe they're fine. And
Yeah.
he did. And he would say, I'm
Oh
fine
gosh.
now. I feel very different. I'm okay. That's that's not the case. They need
Mm-hmm.
more.
Yeah.
Another thing we learned that was I didn't know at the time was that the old philosophy was if you were an addicted person coming out of addiction, you could take no drugs of any kind at all. And that includes medicinal drugs.
Mm-hmm.
So you couldn't take an antidepressant, for example. You couldn't
Okay.
take anxiety medication, a
Mm-hmm.
medication to treat attention deficit disorder. And really, the opposite is true. Many people begin their addiction by self-medicating these other conditions, such as depression or attention deficit. They self-medicate, and then the drugs they're taking get away from them. When they're
Mm-hmm.
done with those drugs, they need the medications, the approved,
Mm-hmm.
scientifically medications more than ever. And many times in my son's journey, he would be in a sober living, for instance, a group home, and
Okay.
they would have rules about absolutely no medications. And if a
Oh,
person was found to have those medications, they would be kicked out of the house when they desperately needed them.
oh wow. How long was he in one of those living situations?
He was in sober living, I know at least twice. And I know there was a third try, but it didn't last long because that group home was badly run, and there were
Yeah.
lots of people cheating the system.
Oh my
But
gosh.
he had two times when he was very successful and lived in a group home for at one point 8 or 9 months
Oh
and
wow.
did extremely well for a year.
Mm-hmm.
Another time he was in a different group home, and after a week or so, they realized that he was taking an antidepressant, and that was
Mm-hmm.
against the rules, and he had to leave.
You said that ignorance about addiction hampered you in dealing with your son and hampered him as well. Can you say a little bit more about that?
Well, when he was in treatment, at one point, he had a very successful treatment in 2010 and
Okay.
stayed away from drugs for a year after that. And in the
No.
center, he heard his very first lecture that hinted at this might be a real disease, and there might be things that are not the person's fault, because
Right.
shame and self-blame are a huge
Hmm.
part of the disease. And he felt ashamed, as many addicted people do, that he wasn't able to stand up and make this go away, fight this off. And he heard the first lecture that it might be a disease, and it really made him feel better, because he felt like, he wrote in a journal that he was keeping, maybe this isn't my fault. Maybe I'm not
Oh,
a bad person. And
yeah.
unfortunately, it was just the beginning of that being able to come out in public knowledge. And I didn't know it. I didn't learn it till it was too late.
Mm. And what about the role of, you mentioned a little bit about shame. What about the role of stamina and shame is in your book?
Well, stigma attaches to addicted people, because throughout history, going back to the Bible and before,
Hmm.
it's been the common knowledge that they're morally bankrupt, they're weak, they have no character, they don't care about others, they're selfish, and that really can be true, but isn't always true. You can be a
Right.
good person with a very bad disease, and
Hmm.
that make you act in ways that are pretty awful.
Yeah.
Uh, and what people see on the outside is the awful behavior. They
Hmm.
don't see that you're very, very ill. Your brain is damaged.
Hmm. Yeah, it's so sad to think that they have this, addiction, and then also they're dealing with all these emotions and feelings, and obviously, especially when people they care about are involved, and it's already so much, and to have that shame and depression, it's I'm sure it's like unbearable. I can't even imagine like what your son went through. And going back to you and your son, how close were you with your son? Did you guys have a good relationship? I know you talked about a little bit about love in your description in your book, and you said that you learned that love is not enough to fight a terrible disease. How does your book explore the complexities of dealing with addiction within the context of love and family?
Well, we did love him to the ends of the earth. And
Mm-hmm.
if love could cure, he would still be here.
Mm-hmm.
And it can't. But throughout his journey, we were close. He relied on me. He would come to
Mm-hmm.
me when he was in trouble, when he'd had a relapse, or something had happened, he lost a job, or, he ran out of money, or something happened. And so he would come to me, and we would spend very significant time together,
Mm-hmm.
figuring out the next step. Wherever he was, several times he was in California. One time he was in the Midwest. I would just drop everything, would get on an
Oh.
airplane, and I'd get a one-way ticket, and we'd I'd go there, and we would hug, and we would say, "We're going to figure this out," and we would
Oh.
devise the next step. Um, so many, many times, we tried together,
Mm-hmm.
but the disease is incredibly powerful, and his behavior was escalating at the very end of his life, to the point that um, the logic, it was it was very difficult, if not impossible, to reach him with
Mm-hmm.
logic, and some of his behavior you couldn't tolerate.
Right.
So we had to distance ourselves from him. But
Mm-hmm.
through most of the journey, we were close.
Another, I guess, a final message that I'll talk about in your book, you mentioned that addiction as a biblical plague of our time. How does the book address the scope and scale of that and the epidemic in America? In what ways does the book emphasize the severity of the issue?
Well, the issue is very severe. It's the fastest growing public health problem in the United States. of course, cancer and heart disease still kill more people, but this is addiction is the fastest growing. And
Mm-hmm.
the thing is that the you mentioned the Bible and the biblical plague.
Yeah.
I will say that um, my son developed faith in
Oh, wow.
he developed faith in the depths of his addiction when he was very humbled and
Mm-hmm.
discouraged by his
Mm-hmm.
inability to get well. And he was converted to
Oh,
a love of Jesus Christ. And that, I have to say, is the best thing that happened,
yeah.
because now I know
Oh,
he's safe. He's
yeah.
he's with Jesus, and he was not a believer, and he was also kind of a cynic. He was kind of like, I don't need that. And then after he became humbled, he had a wonderful conversion experience, and
Oh,
he
wow.
devoted to Jesus Christ after that. And so that is my greatest comfort that has come out of all
Yeah.
of it.
Oh, wow. That's amazing. So, did that come from you? Because I know that you have faith as well.
Well, indirectly, it came from me in that
Mm-hmm.
there was a time that he was living in our house with my husband and I, and he was already a grown man, and we had
Mm-hmm.
come in while he figured out kind of what he was going to do next. But
Mm-hmm.
one of the rules for living in our house was that he had to go to church with me. And so he had to. And we were sitting in a church class. We were taking a class on Wednesday nights, and he was sitting there, and I looked over at him, and he had tears in his eyes. And I, was surprised, and the tears stayed there for the entire rest of the class and the drive home. And I said to him, what is happening? And he
Mm-hmm.
said that he had said to himself silently, God, if you're real, reveal yourself. And he had felt this incredible peace, this incredible feeling just came over him that everything was okay in
Mm-hmm.
at peace. And he said, I know that was the Holy Spirit just descending on me. And so it was the Holy Spirit did the conversion, but I indirectly helped it by putting him in that seat in the
Oh,
church.
wow. Oh my gosh. Um, so what inspired your book to actually publish it and share your story and research and findings?
Well, part of it was for my own benefit. I had been so confused and baffled all the years. We battled addiction for 20 years,
Oh,
um,
wow.
from middle school to his death at the age of 36. And
Mm-hmm.
all that time, I had just been so confused as to why can't he stop this? Why would he want to do this?
Yeah.
What do we do? And so for me, the research was a way to learn what was really going on. And
Mm-hmm.
I have a need for rationality. I needed that. I needed to
Mm-hmm.
figure it out. And also just the writing it all down, going back through his journals, everything that I could collect about him helped me. I said, I won't let go. I won't let him go until I know every shred that I possibly can. And I won't let him fade into the background until I thoroughly
Oh
know.
my gosh. That's amazing.
Well, in some ways, there's never going to be closure. There's never going to
Right.
be in my life. There's never going to be peace in my heart. But I can come closer to acceptance having written this all down.
Yeah, I'm sure writing your book was sort of healing in itself. So you've written books before. You've had professional publications, correct?
Yes, in my career, I published a book that sold very well about American nuclear history and the
Oh,
history
wow.
of the weapons production sites where the United States made plutonium. And
Mm-hmm.
how those production processes put wastes into the environment. And now there's a huge waste cleanup going on. So I wrote about all of that, and that book sold very well, but
Hmm.
nothing like
It
it
was,
would.
yeah.
Subject totally, absolutely, totally different.
When did you start writing this book, Witness to Addiction?
Well, after my son's death, I my first instinct, and it really was an instinct, not really a choice, was I just wanted to collect all the information about him.
Hmm.
So I collected everything, from an airplane ticket to a bus ticket to talking to his friends and coworkers and people who had known him, and then
Hmm.
journals and text messages we'd written back and forth. We texting was fairly new, but we had a couple years worth of text messages, so I collected all that and I read it and I tried to think, how does this fit together, at the same time doing research on the brain science of addiction? And then I could see, okay, this was a turning point. This was a turning point. And so after about 4 years is when I actually started to write.
Okay. And how long did it take you to complete your book?
It took 5 years. And
Okay.
because you know, I have no deadline. It was
Hmm.
just for me.
Right.
And I felt like I want to make sure, I want to go back over it. If I read another book, something new, I'd learn something, I'd go back and say, where does this fit? So I put it together slowly, and when it felt right.
And so when did you know that it was completed and that you wanted to seek publishing and, as for you, self-publishing?
Well, I had a couple of very good friends read the manuscript,
Okay.
and they basically, both of them said, independent of each other, there are lessons here that you should share, that other
Hmm.
people would benefit from. And I kept saying, well, no, it's too private. It's too private. And
It's personal.
they
Yeah.
said, but you could do some good. You could share this knowledge that was so hard. The knowledge is hard won,
Yeah.
uh, but you could share it. And that would, then you could say that his death, had meaning for others. And
Hmm.
really, when you're faced with a terrible tragedy, one of the ways to move forward is to help other people.
Hmm. I can't imagine going through that as a mother. How were you affected by his addiction? How is your family affected by his addiction?
But it took a terrible toll. The addiction took a terrible toll on us. Um, you know, there's all kinds of aspects. Of course, there's stress and worry. There is
Hmm.
expense. I mean, there are many, many times that he couldn't pay his own bills. There's
Hmm.
the expense of treatment. There's the expense of travel. There is what is called in the literature a shadow child effect, and that is the other children in the family are neglected, sort of, not totally, but they
Hmm.
are, you don't pay as much attention to them. Maybe you don't attend
Right.
school events. You don't do as many things with them because you're so consumed and busy with the addicted person. And then,
Hmm.
of course, a marriage is strained because
Hmm.
you're stressed, you're spending money, you're spending time away from home, you're in times absolutely living in terror that this person, will be gone from you. And so the stresses are terrible.
Hmm. What should families do when they learn that a family member is using drugs or is addicted?
When a family finds that a family member is addicted, I advise four things. And first thing I've talked about, which is the family should sit down and make their decision together as
Hmm.
to their boundaries, their standards. What are you going to do if the person asks you for money? What are you going to do if the person, you've told them they can't come home, but you find they're sneaking in and sleeping in your garage? You have to have these decisions made as a family and stick to them, because the
Mm-hmm.
family will be damaged. If, for instance, a person, you've said they can't come to dinner if they're high. Well,
Mm-hmm.
they show up at the door and they're intoxicated, and somebody slips them $50. Well, that undermines the entire integrity of the family's decisions. And,
Right.
and when other family members find out about it, there's going to be trouble and
Mm-hmm.
conflict. That
Yeah.
just magnifies like a pebble in a pond in the ripple effect. So
Mm-hmm.
that's number one. I think the other thing is that every member of the family needs to find a support group. And it doesn't have to be the same, it can be separate groups or the same. But you've got to have a place where you're with other people that are going through this,
Mm-hmm.
because it's very isolating to be around friends whose lives are great,
Yeah.
whose kids are progressing and doing well in school and going off to their
It's
careers,
hard to see, right? Yeah.
and your family's falling apart. And so you need to be around people. You absolutely need it to be around
Mm-hmm.
people that are also suffering. And the other thing is that you should go out as a family and have some fun together, that where you agree we are not going to talk about addiction or mention it.
Mm-hmm.
It may be screaming inside your head, that's all you're thinking about, but you're not going to talk about it. And I think the fourth thing, the most important of all, is to say to the addicted person, I will be here when you want to make a positive choice. I will never
Mm-hmm.
abandon you. If you can figure this out, great. If you're ready for help, I'm here. But you should never say, don't come back till you fix this.
Yeah. That's not helpful at all. Um, and I'm sure all of that is in your book as well, and more. As far as your book, is there a part that you feel most connected with? Is there a section or a part? Because I know that it is like a practical hand guide, but it's also like has your story and has like deep and touching moments in your story. Is there one in particular that stands out to you?
Well, we had a roller coaster ride, which addiction is a roller coaster ride. And so sometimes things are great and you feel like maybe it's over and you've left it behind you. And then there are other times of crisis where you're just thrown in an instant. In one phone call, you're thrown into a
Mm-hmm.
terrible situation. And so I think both of those kinds of things will stand out to me. One would be, a rescue where he was desperately sick. And I just
Mm-hmm.
dropped everything and got on an airplane and just
Mm-hmm.
went. Um, another Other times would be the fun times when
Yeah.
he seemed to be well, and he was a great conversationalist, a great, friend to be around, and we'd go off and explore the mountains around San Francisco uh,
Mm-hmm.
together, mother and son. We just have so
Well,
much fun. So there are both kinds of experiences that stand out.
I want to quickly read you a review of your book, if that's okay, that I really loved and thought was really beautifully said. Can I read it to you?
Sure.
So it says, one of the most real and powerful books I've ever read. This is a story that needs to be written to show both the person suffering from substance abuse and the person suffering for the person suffering from substance abuse addiction's point of view. And I just really, really like that. Is there a like review that you've had that you really liked, or what is the feedback you received from your book?
Well, I hadn't seen that review that you just read, and I
Yeah,
love it.
I think it's on Westbow Press, and I really liked it, so I just wanted to share it with you.
I do love it. And I think that, the book is, I'll say, shocking in
Mm-hmm.
that it's very raw, it's very real, it's very
Mm-hmm.
parts of it are very difficult to read. I've had people tell me they can read a few chapters and then they have to put it away for a
Take a
while.
break. Mm-hmm.
It's intense.
Mm-hmm.
And so I want it to convey the fact that this is reality. Life with a
Mm-hmm.
seriously addicted person is seriously not just difficult, but often horrendous.
Yeah.
And but I also want um, hopefully a review to convey the fact that there are things we can all do, all of
Right.
us, whether you're an employer, there's a
Mm-hmm.
movement, a very big movement for recovery ready workplaces and recovery friendly workplaces. And that is all coming out of the Department of Labor. There are whole ways that you can react to do better than we did when I was going through this.
Right. What was the response you had from your family when your book um, came out, or even when you had the idea that you wanted to publish it and share it? What was that like?
Well, um, some of them found it very difficult to read because
Yeah.
I had done the research to find, I'll say, every crack and crevice in my son's life. Things that I put together in logical sequence that at the time they happened, they didn't know about.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and then things that happened, but he later in treatment would write about. And that would give us insight to why these things had happened.
Mm-hmm.
And so people were curious, they were glad to have that knowledge, but some family members, one in particular, says, I couldn't read past the first chapter. I'm
Oh
never going to
wow.
read it because it's too painful.
Too hard. Mm-hmm.
And another, I have a cousin who's a psychologist, and before I published it, he said, you don't need to publish it. It's already done what it needed to do for you in the process of writing. And that's true. It did. But then, as I said, people told me that some of the lessons could help others.
Yeah. And what about your church and your community? What feedback have you received from people of those two communities?
Well, again, it's that my community, my church have said it's very intense, but it's
Mm-hmm.
very necessary
Yeah.
because, we're all driving around our communities and we're seeing people who are homeless, and we're seeing people who are, obviously intoxicated or high,
Mm-hmm.
and we're seeing them come into stores and have to be removed. And
Right.
we are all, kind of worried. What are we seeing? How is our society changing? And how are we going to handle this? And
Mm-hmm.
so I think people are glad to have some ideas, some practical ideas.
Mm-hmm. What was your writing experience like? What was your writing process like for this book specifically?
Well, I would usually write in the evening,
Okay.
and I would be reading books and researching, throughout my life, doing my regular life. And in the process, I started a recovery coalition, and
Mm-hmm.
we grew and grew and grew, and we are the largest in Washington state.
That's amazing.
And we're 200 miles from Seattle. So
Mm-hmm.
usually in our state, everything that's big is in Seattle.
Yeah.
We are bigger. We are bigger, and so we're proud of that. And while I was building this coalition, I met some wonderful people. We work together. We have a broad coalition, and some of the people are addiction professionals, treatment
Mm-hmm.
professionals, doctors, social workers, mental health counselors, and I've learned tremendously from them. And I've loved the camaraderie of people coming together and saying, this is something our community needs, because if we don't do it,
Right.
it's things are going to get worse.
Mm-hmm. Can you go a little bit more into yourself and what you do for a living and your background and your knowledge and just experience in general with addiction the years since you lost your son. I know you mentioned the Recovery Coalition.
Well, I long ago earned a PhD and became
Mm-hmm.
a researcher, writer, and did, scientific research. It was science, the science of radiochemistry and radionuclides. And so it was a different life. And I
Mm-hmm.
actually loved my job. I loved it
Mm-hmm.
for years. But what I know is that while I was doing the job and the addiction came into our life and then got worse and worse, um, at that time, and I worked in the same place for 23 years, I never told anyone, not
Oh,
my
wow.
not my supervisors, not my coworkers, not anyone, that I was going through this because of the stigma and shame. And I
Mm-hmm.
now, I've retired. I see those people, some of them
Mm-hmm.
and in town, and they write to me because they've seen the book, and they
Oh,
say,
wow.
"Never knew. How
Wow.
did
Yeah.
you do it all those years?" And it was just that, you didn't talk about it. So today, I'd say number one lesson for
Let's talk
everyone
about it.
about it.
Mm-hmm.
Open it up. It shouldn't be a secret. It shouldn't be shameful. It is a real illness.
Mm-hmm.
If you know someone who's addicted or their family members going through it, reach out, talk, go for coffee, bring them a
Ask them
cup.
how they're doing. Yeah.
Because in the past, if somebody hinted or said their person was in addiction, you just stop. Conversation stops.
It's too
And
hard to talk about. Yeah.
and no one knows what to say. So,
Mm-hmm.
listener, let the
Mm-hmm.
person talk.
And that's probably a little bit of what pushed you so hard into the recovery movement. What else has pushed you so hard into getting involved in recovery?
Well, my son would want me to. He
Mm-hmm.
believed that, you know, that he suffered terribly, and he wouldn't want other people to suffer
Mm-hmm.
if something could be done. In our
Mm-hmm.
community, we have about 300, little over 300,000 people. So
Oh,
it's not
wow.
a tiny town, but it's not a big city.
Mm-hmm.
We have no recovery center where people are inpatient, can stay overnight and be treated for a month or more. And we
Mm-hmm.
have no detoxification facility. So people have to leave town if they want to find treatment. And sometimes they're too broke. They're
Yeah,
too,
it's impossible to do that.
yeah, they're too sick to think
Mm-hmm.
straight and get the arrangements made. And so I decided we need to have a recovery center here
Mm-hmm.
where people can go in the door. We're calling it the no wrong door concept. You go in, you will be admitted. You will 100% of the time. And if you then have an assessment and it's figured out by clinical professionals what you need to do next. Do you need inpatient treatment? Do you need medication? Do you need outpatient treatment? Is your main primary diagnosis mental health rather than drug abuse? Um, Figure that out and go on to the next step. But no one will be turned away and told, we have to examine your insurance paperwork and
Mm-hmm.
we'll call you back in 3 weeks. That doesn't work. It
3 weeks
costs,
is a long time. Yeah.
it can cost your life. If you're ready for
Mm-hmm.
treatment, you can't get treatment when you need it. You may go
Mm-hmm.
out, you feel so hopeless, you'll go back to the drugs, and that's when people are lost.
Yeah. What advice would you give to other like communities who want to start research activities like in their area?
Well, I do a whole presentation on organizing and how to
Okay.
organize. And really, the first step is to look for your natural allies. Of course, the police and law enforcement, they're your ally because they don't like having to arrest the same people over and over. They don't
Mm-hmm.
like the fact that so much of their time is taken up with petty crimes and,
Mm-hmm.
having to move homeless people. and respond to people who've gone into a store and acted inappropriately.
Mm-hmm.
That's not why they became police. They want to do, solve major crimes. And
Mm-hmm.
so they're your natural ally. So right away, reach out to them.
Mm-hmm.
Um, there's other groups that are your natural allies. Of course, people in recovery and their families, the families of addicted people, medical professionals, primary care doctors really don't want addicted people in their practice and in their treatment
Mm-hmm.
because they don't have the skills to help them. They're not trained in that. So they
Mm-hmm.
want a place that they can send people. Like we
Right.
talked about before, elected officials,
Mm-hmm.
they're getting complaints. Faith leaders in their churches and synagogues, they're getting whispered pleas for help
Mm-hmm.
from the parishioners saying, I've got this terrible problem in my family. What do I do? All of these groups of people, from faith leaders to elected officials to police to doctors, they are going to be your natural allies. So call them
Mm-hmm.
together in a meeting and,
Mm-hmm.
start strategizing. But don't try to do it alone because
Mm-hmm.
your little group of friends and people that you met in a support group, that's not enough.
How long did it take you to, or like, where did you start specifically? How long did it take you to like create this recovery coalition?
We've been active for not quite 6 years. It'll be 6 years in the spring.
Okay.
And
Wow,
so
that's
that's the
amazing.
first thing. It started with a little group of my friends, about 8 friends.
Okay.
And we said, we are going to reach out to this, group that I
Mm-hmm.
strategized about. And
Mm-hmm.
we're going to call a meeting and just bring them together and sort of lay out the problem. Here's the problem. We don't
Mm-hmm.
have services. Our community is getting to look different than it used to look. And so
Mm-hmm.
what do we do together? And, then you form a structure, you form committees, we became a 501c3 nonprofit. Then we began to form, articles, bylaws.
Mm-hmm.
It takes a lot of organizing, got to be organized. And if you want donation, you've got to organize as a nonprofit because we can give a tax break to anyone who donates to us. And
Mm-hmm.
so we've been able to get people to give as much as $25,000 because they're getting a tax break because we are a nonprofit.
Mm-hmm. So since this has happened, what changes have you seen in addiction and recovery fields in the past 9 years since your son passed away?
Wonderful changes. A
Mm-hmm.
lot of the changes have been the lawsuits against the drug manufacturers, the drug distributors, the drug stores, and all of the agencies that contributed to not flagging oversized orders. There have been over 2,600 lawsuits against drug makers. Drug distributors were supposed to let the government, the DEA, know if there were pharmacies that were ordering, millions of opioid pain pills. And
Mm-hmm.
here they may be a fairly small town, but they order 1 million pain pills. That order was supposed to be flagged for investigation, and it wasn't. And so there have been lawsuits and the lawsuits have been successful. So companies
Mm-hmm.
pay millions of dollars. There's now an opioid lawsuit settlement fund where every state in the union is receiving money from these companies they lost in a lawsuit, and they
Mm-hmm.
have to fund drug treatment with this money. So the legal systems have been great. Also, I do see more talk about this, more awareness. For instance, our state, and I know some other states have recovery advocacy days where recovery
Mm-hmm.
advocates from all over the state will descend on the state capitol. We're doing that
Oh,
next week
next
in,
week, you said?
yes, in Olympia,
Oh,
Washington.
wow. Oh, wow.
So
That's amazing.
come together in a huge rally, and then we, visit legislators all day long, and and, tell them the kinds of bills that we would like them to support,
Mm-hmm.
bills that would, break down some of the insurance barriers. In our state, we do favor, and I personally favor, involuntary commitment. If someone is so badly addicted that they can't make a good decision on their own, there can
Mm-hmm.
be voluntary commitment. I don't know that all states will be in favor of that, but we are, and we've already passed a law here, and now we're trying to strengthen that law. Different types of other laws, we will advocate for more education programs for treatment professionals so that treatment professionals, there's a shortage nationwide.
Mm-hmm.
The more colleges in the state will institute programs to train these professions. Other types of things that we advocate for. So there's a lot of publicity that comes with that.
Mm-hmm.
It's an
Yeah.
action, networking, so that you may meet somebody from another city in your state that you can work with on something else.
Yeah. People are affected by addiction say that gratitude is essential for recovery. Do you believe that? And have you found things to be grateful for in this whole experience?
Absolutely. I have a lot of gratitude. As I said, my greatest thing that I'm grateful for is that my son found the saving power of Jesus Christ in his life before he died.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm so grateful for the 36 years I had with my son. Um,
Mm-hmm.
some of it was terrible, but I wouldn't have missed it for the world. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm grateful for the people I've met who also care about this cause. We are warriors without a battle plan. We're just out there
Mm-hmm.
trying to do things. And some
Mm-hmm.
great people that I've met, I wouldn't have met otherwise. And I'm grateful that my community has embraced this instead of saying, oh, we don't want that here, not in my
Mm-hmm.
backyard. My community did not say that. They said, yes, how can we
Very
help?
welcoming. Mm-hmm. Is that something you were surprised about in a little way, or?
This is a very conservative area where I live,
Mm-hmm.
and I was worried that maybe the reaction would be, we don't want to build a recovery center because we don't have that problem, and we don't want anybody to think we do.
Mm-hmm.
That was not the response, and I was so
I'm
grateful.
glad. Yeah, I'm glad it was a good response. Well, I think we're almost going to wrap up. I do have a couple more questions for you. One of them being, what are your hopes for this book?
Well, I'd like people to buy the book and read it and learn from
Mm-hmm.
it and go out and become warriors in their community for
Mm-hmm.
the cause of addiction and addiction recovery.
And what would you say to someone specifically that is witness to addiction or someone that knows of someone who is addicted?
Well, first of all, embrace the person. Don't embrace
Mm-hmm.
the behavior or the choices, but embrace the person. Let them know they're a valuable person and that you believe they're sick and that you believe they can get well. There are things that can be done. And
Mm-hmm.
so start with that acceptance and accept their family and accept everything so that they feel the shame is slipping away and the
Mm-hmm.
falling off their shoulders because it's very heavy.
All right. Well, is there anything else that you would like to share with our audience today?
No, I think it's been a great interview. You asked a lot of good questions.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much. Well, it's been amazing chatting with you. Your drive and dedication is amazing, and it's clear that this is so important to you, and how important your son meant to you. And I'm sure he would be very proud. And it's amazing that you published it and people can read it and learn more about the opioid epidemic as well. And so you can also purchase Michele Gerber's book at westbowpress.com and Amazon and Barnes & Noble. Thank you so much for joining me today, Dr. Gerber, and I hope you have a great day.